The allowance of yourself to be vulnerable really is actually a way to get through things, and it's actually more courageous than not looking.
I'm really looking forward to having the chance to speak with you today, Lydia.
Likewise. No, me too. I am very excited to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So I guess I could start with just a very general question, and then we can, dig deeper from there. But what is it that led you to becoming and I don't want to just like, you're a photographer and a videographer, I think. So did you start doing one before the other, or is one more of what you tend to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I do use photography. I don't call myself a photographer. Maybe I should, but I feel much more like an artist than I feel like a photographer, because I don't take the camera around with me. It's very specific, to place. It's very specific to creating something that I want to create, and I think the camera happens to be something that I can do it with. So I do call myself an artist. I'm not a videographer. I do make videos. I've started adding them in the last few years of my work, but technically I am far from a videographer. I'm learning as I go along here very much. It seems like what has happened with the videos is that they're sort of this extension of my still portraits, and they really just carry out what I'm trying to say through still portraiture in a kind of a maybe more like, I don't know if collaborative is the word, with the viewer, right? Because with the model, it's always very collaborative. But I think with the viewer, it kind of brings the viewer as if they're really dealing with like a real person, because the women in the videos are so there. It's like my still photos kind of just get extended into time, I suppose, is kind of what happens. So I guess I didn't answer your question about how did I get into it.
That was a better answer to a better question I could have asked. That was a great answer. But maybe just give me a little bit of background. I was curious how you got into your work as an artist.
Some people I think are just born visual. I guess it's a born thing. I feel like I have just been very visual since I was very, very young. And that's how I understand things. When I'm listening to someone's story, I have to literally make a picture in my mind. And I have to kind of lay it. I have to be seeing what I'm thinking about, what I'm hearing. I can't not have a visual in my head to kind of understand what's going on. I think it's been a way for me to express things I wasn't able to express as a child. I was born here when my parents were here very temporarily, and from Greece. They came for just like a couple of years to finish their degrees. And while they were here, they had me and my sister, and we moved back. Like before I was 2, we had moved back to Greece. So, these were people, I don't even think they spoke English when they were here for those 2 years. They must have picked up something, but though my mother, crazily enough, tells me that my first word was umbrella. So there must have been something. Obviously that's nuts. But, by the time I was 2, we had moved back to Greece. It was difficult. I was in a country in the States where my parents really were aliens, feeling very much like aliens. So I think it must have been a fairly unnerving experience for them, which, obviously would translate to the kids, to us. And then we moved to Greece, which is again another like whipsaw, like just kind of coming from one uncomfortable place, moving to another place that was perhaps more comfortable for them, though both my parents started their medical practices there. I have these vague recollections of a lot of discomfort. And then when I was 6, my dad said, that's it. I can't do it here. We can't practice medicine here. And we flipped around. So we came back to the States, it was like October. I remember being in, I think it was kindergarten, and not speaking English. I will never forget this Mrs. Cook, my kindergarten teacher. She was so kind, and But I remember how traumatic it was. And then really we ended up moving around a lot until I was 8, and that 3 more times. So till the time I was 8, we had moved about 5 times. And language was, I think, something that had been difficult for especially my mother. And I guess on some level, it's been something that's been very, very important to me. And I never felt like I could articulate exactly what I wanted. And I think through images, especially through the camera, I've been able to kind of put down, like in a literal way, in an image, exactly what when I see it, one of my images on a piece of paper, I feel like, wow, I feel that. Like that's what I feel. And it's like something that's wordless for me. It's something that's very hard to specifically articulate. There's also kind of a sense that we really weren't encouraged to express ourselves as children. And so becoming an artist, I think, was really for me a real form of defiance. It was a form of, I'm going to speak. I am going to say it, and I'm going to say it the way I need to say it, which is really not encouraged. From people who had already, they'd been through the war, the big war, then they'd been through the Civil War right after that in Greece. They had their own, share, I suppose, of difficulties. But it was my way to just do what I wanted to do, just be me.
I do find it interesting because you are very articulate. So if that was an issue growing up, it's certainly not now. Express yourself very well in words. But I'm also very taken by the 4 photographs behind you, and the 2 at the top behind you are very striking. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me the 2 hands reaching into fruit that looks like it's aging, and on the other side, plants that have died. I was wondering, can you tell me a little bit, because as you've been talking, I'm paying very much attention to what you're saying, but I'm also very struck by the photographs behind you.
That is a series that I called My Tangerine Dream. And I have been I'm known for portraiture, and I've been making portraits since, I got out of art school. I started with portraits of my children, and then to a certain point, I moved to a little bit of still life when my kids decided to stop letting me take pictures of them. But I came back to portraiture in 2005, and it was in color, and kind of became known around 2005 for my portraiture work. And I was working on a series called Unspoken in 2019. I had done a residency up at Mass MoCA, and I was, working on it was like mostly a video project, though I do have still photographs. But the main thrust of the project was video. And I was all excited to come back and work on it, and the pandemic hit. So, but I had no obligations, which I really kind of loved. I had stopped teaching, and I love portraiture. I love portraiture. I love working with people, but there's a lot of stress involved in terms of, and maybe stress isn't the right word, but what time can you come? What time can I do it? How is the weather going to be? And even just after so many years of making portraits, to this day, I have a portrait session scheduled for this afternoon. To this day, after so many years of making portraits, I still get nervous. I mean, it's really bizarre, but it's like the old childhood sort of anxiety coming through. So the pandemic, it all went away. I was just making sort of still, I was like, well, what am I going to do? I have to make photographs. As terrible as the pandemic was for a lot of people, for me, I was able to just get into my work. So this work that you're referring to, well, I had to think of something to do. I always have a lot of fabrics in my studio because I use fabrics a lot in all of my old portraiture work. So I would put up a fabric, and then I'd start to find things like old, like the leaves you can see in this portrait, and some of the old fruits and vegetables. Sometimes there are books, there are all kinds of things. We live on this 70-acre farm, so there's a lot of nature around me. So mostly things that are natural is what I try to bring into my work. So I started bringing all these things in, and I started making a series of still lifes. And my niece, she's my muse who loves to pose for me. So she was the only one in the house who was willing to come out and sort of take a break from her own studies. And it's her arms and face in that series that sometimes pop up. The series, as much as I've been working in color, everything up to this point was pretty monochrome, very toned down, very muted. And the pandemic for me changed the bar in some ways of just having no expectations on me at all. And all of a sudden the work became colorful and bright. And like I, in my own sort of personal place and space, had come to like this, I don't know, sort of metaphorically more colorful place, more vibrant place. My tangerine dream is really a reference to how my mother used to, she was meticulous. That's one of the good things I got from her. And when she would peel tangerines, I always thought it was a very Greek thing, but I could be wrong. She would peel them and she would just pith. She would be like, oh, no, don't eat it. Like I would just eat it. She goes, no, take off all that white stuff. Take it off. You never eat that. And so when she would peel it for me, she would take everything off like meticulously. And I felt so safe that she was really, really taking care in those moments. So I called it my tangerine dream because of what I remembered about feeling so safe as a child in those moments. And these pictures are, they're interesting. They're mysterious, I think, and they're both very colorful. But there's a little spook. I don't know if spooky is the right word. There's something more sinister that goes on behind the scenes. Yeah. So I think in all of my work, I think you feel both a sense of clarity and a sense of something that is not being said. And I guess maybe that's one of the threads now that I think it's the first time I've thought about it that way, but there's always something not being said in all of my work, which is probably part of the why I make work to try to speak. But the things that I was really taught as a very young child not to expose, those are the things that I actually try to look at very closely. It's hard to look at stuff that you've been really afraid to look at, but that's kind of what I try to do.
It's very interesting. I want to come back to that. I'm going to go on a very small tangent, art history tangent, which is not my strength at all. So there were just like two things that came to me as you were speaking about those photographs and the colors. And one was, and I'm just going to like pull Rembrandt out of my brain because that speaks to me around the colors and it almost feels like those are micro shots of a painting of somebody's hand, and these fruits and these leaves and the dying things. It feels very rich and evocative of a painting by Rembrandt or somebody in that era, and also that idea of memento mori. So, because to be totally honest, those pictures to me are sort of death-like. To me, it looks like those arms are of a person that is no longer alive. But they're very evocative, very beautiful. The colors are really rich. But I think maybe when you were saying before, that feeling, that eerie feeling, for me is a little bit like, I feel like those hands have passed on.
That's actually kind of an interesting thought. Like I hadn't really gone there. Rembrandt, when you mentioned Rembrandt, Rembrandt is really one of my, when I go to a museum, those are the first paintings I look at. They really, and I think a lot of my work moves in that direction. Something about the lighting, the darkness in the background with just like this sort of spotlight on an emotion and like no context, just really all about what's going on between the model and the artist and what the artist wants to say through the model. When you refer to details, that's also kind of interesting. These pictures are really large, they're like 40 by 40. But sure, they're details. And I guess what I can say to that is detail is, my husband constantly, he's like, oh my God, the detail, like, could we just slow down on the detail? Even just when I wash the dishes, I'm like, oh my God, like you left some spots on the dishes, like you can't do that.
Even when you said your mom would take the white bits off the tangerines, like that's detail. That's a super attention to detail, which is what you see in these photos. It's super cool.
That's true. Interesting, the death. Now, that's funny because the way I was explaining them was how much they brought me, how much to me they feel like there's so much more alive. I suppose, and this is really the first time I'm even thinking in this direction, but I suppose it's because I'm able to speak about some of the very difficult things that I have been through without feeling the difficulty. So maybe death is in some ways like a metaphor for some of the ways I felt. I mean, dead is a little, that's a little literal, but some of the deaths that I imagined, that some of the things that were kind of taken, tamped down in me, that I feel like as an older person, as a woman who's, now in a mature age, I have really allowed myself to feel things that I never allowed, good things about myself that I never really allowed myself to feel before. So maybe it's this balance. And, in a lot of like that image on this one, with the hand coming down, I mean, there is this almost like I see it as a scale a little bit, like she's, how you maybe pull like coffee beans out of a pot and you're going to measure how many you're going to use or something like that. Like there's a kind of a scale. I mean, there is this sort of, death, I suppose, maybe death in a psychological sense of that certain feelings dying.
I could read more, I may be reading more into it, but maybe it's also just like a letting go, like on the other side, that one with the hand that's hanging a bit more loosely,
right,
has let go.
Right.
And isn't trying to control. So that one is there and the fruit's been peeled. Somebody's eaten the fruit maybe. And this is
because there was a lot of letting go in this. Like that is true. Like I was just letting it. I just felt like, no one's ever going to see this work. I'm just going to just do this. And it ended up being it's actually a very beautiful series. The images themselves, they're large and they're bold and they're kind of both very beautiful and also there's something very sinister that's kind of lurking in the background. And that, I suppose that is part of what goes on in a lot of my work in different ways. Maybe it's more literal with this work, maybe more obvious, not literal, but obvious in this work.
When you said that it's not a work that would be seen by someone, what did you mean by that? Like, is this something that you haven't put out in the world? Is this something that you've kept for yourself or?
When the pandemic first started, we had like no idea how long we'd be here. It could be years. Like we had really no idea. So I guess I just thought, what, I'm just doing this right now. Let's see what happens. And then I finally, after I made a lot of them, I started to print them and I was like, wow, these are really beautiful. And so, no, I'm actually going to have a show in January where I am going to show some of these. So they will come out. They haven't been out in the world yet, but they're going to start to come out soon.
So just taking a step back, because you mentioned earlier, so you live on a 70-acre piece of land and nature figures very prominently in your work. Why is that? Or what is it about the nature that comes into your work that you feel is expressive of what you want to say?
It's a farm, and it's a farm that we reforested. We moved here from New York City about 30 years ago. And, the farmers out here don't let trees on the farms because they cause weeds and they just don't like them. It's just they clear them. So when we first moved here, there were no trees on this farm, and we're like tree nuts, if you want to put it that way. And my father, who had also come from a farm in Greece, he had lived on a farm like in a smaller village. And my parents don't live that far from us. They're gone now, but he used to come out every weekend, and for 10 years. We would plant like 100 trees to reforest. We didn't reforest the whole thing, like it's still a farm, like a working farm, parts of it, but we reforested about half of it. And it's also about my father, my husband and I would do this, the three of us. And the land for him, this is how my father sort of expressed himself, I think, through nature. And he would come out here on weekends, he was an older man, and he would spend all day, like Saturday and Sunday with us digging. And, I learned so much about my relationship with nature. Has a lot to do with my relationship with my father, how you could just let it go, and letting it go, which is what we've done here. This idea of letting go and not being restricted and not feeling like things have to be a very specific way. We don't have like direct neighbors, so we don't see people in our, we walk outside, we don't see anybody. And think it expresses a kind of a oneness that I feel with nature, how it's important to be near it, to look out my window and not see any homes, to not see any buildings, to feel like I am unencumbered by the things that man, woman, human beings have done to the earth. And I think in some ways, like that's why in all of my work you don't see buildings, you don't see structures, you don't see remnants of like mankind. What you see are just they're like nowhere. You know, whether they're out in the nature or they're in my studio, which is also on this property. They're really like in an undefined space. And nature for me is this beautiful kind of place of growth, of letting go, of regeneration, of rebirth in a way.
So the idea of letting go has come up a few times since we started talking. And now I'm going to move to what's up from my bottom left. So go back to the portraits that you say are the main thing that you do. So the idea of taking portraits of people on your land, out in nature, far, like you said, from other buildings or other people. I'm just wondering about the connection between that and letting go for your subjects. So when you put them out in that space, is part of the idea that they can also let go of, I don't know, of expectations of themselves or other people seeing them for who they think they are as opposed to who they think they see themselves as, or you see them as?
That's a great question.
It took me a while to articulate that one. I'm happy you heard the question in that, because it's like got to the end, I was like, Sarah, what are you asking her? But like, I think you heard it.
It was
That's
a
good.
great question. Let me see if I can go back from the beginning because I really clicked onto a bunch of things. So for the first and foremost, I do it here because it's home, and my work is a lot about home. You know, it's about family, it's about relationships, it's about the connections we forge very, very early on and how those affect us later on. So the fact that it's here on this land that also happens to be full of nature brings in a lot of old history, you know, personal history. The fact that I do women, that's very specific. I mean, right around 2013, I basically started to focus on women. 2013, 2014, I started to focus on women and my connections with women. So that is like a lot of the background. So I think probably the main impetus for making work is my own. It's about what I need to do and what I need to express. But what has happened, and this is one of the things I think you kind of touched on, what has happened is when these women come out here, I hear this often. They're like, after they've left, I hear them often say, it was so peaceful. It was so much like letting go and just like being at one in nature while you do your thing. And I was just able to let go myself. A really, really important part of my practice is the relationship between us. Like that is part of the process, that I don't ask them to do anything except come to my place, of course, and be here for me and just look at the camera. Besides that, like I'm not asking them to perform for me, you know, I don't ask them to do something that's going to give me this fabulous shot. Instead, I simply ask them to be and to just let go, just be themselves. So it's like these sessions where there's not a lot. I mean, there's enough said that we're comfortable. And, you know, I think you can see that in the work. There's a real trust there. And we both just start to kind of drop our facades. And that's another part of the work, this letting go of the face that we show to the world. And while there's not a lot of expression, if you actually see the portraits in life, like they're large, you know, the faces are like life size or so. And there's a lot inside. There's a lot behind that sort of expression that's not doing a whole lot. And it's really, the work is about what goes on beneath them. And I think I'm trying to understand when I make photographs of these women, I'm trying to, I suppose, on some level, firstly, like connect without having to be somebody else, you know, connect without having to, you know, play a social game and, you know, put on my social face. It is so much about connecting like that and trying, I think, as a sort of a back motive in a way for me to understand something about someone else when I'm feeling like, I guess because I like to say it's a very egalitarian process, right? I like to say that in reality, it's never really egalitarian. When you're the photographer, you always have the power. But I am trying, to kind of step back from like the authoritarian sort of mother figure, so to speak, and be as democratic as we can in, photographer model relationship as much as we can go, and sort of allowing them the power to just be themselves. And in the process, try to understand what I can glean about who they really are. And in that process, what do I understand? When I understand something about them, what does that tell me about me?
Interesting. So what does that tell you about you?
I guess, I mean, it's nothing specific. I don't think it's anything specific. I always say when the women leave, I always say, I feel like, first of all, I'm in love with them. Like I love them forever, because I've seen like a very clear part. I've seen a part of their hearts just from looking. I like to say, I feel like I know their secrets. Now I don't. I mean, they haven't told me they may or may not have said things, but I certainly don't know their real secrets. But I feel like from that hour and a half, whatever, however long we've been together, 2 hours that we've been together, I can sense what their heart feels. I can sense them. And I can sort of sense that I think it's that connection that makes me feel so connected to myself, I guess. I guess it's a connection that I forge that in a way is kind of like a healing connection for me. And that helps me understand myself and heal within my own self just a little bit more. Yeah.
I'm so tempted to ask, and I also know it's so not a PC thing to say at all, really, but the fact that you are choosing to photograph women and you are a woman doing that. So it wouldn't be the same if somebody else was taking their photographs. I think there is something about being a woman taking photographs of women where you can establish a basic bond or sense of trust, which you can build on.
I think my images and what comes out of them is first and foremost the number one, that I'm a woman, but also number one, I'm the particular woman that I am. The specific woman who's very interested in democratic relationships in a kind of egalitarian sense where you're not dealing with someone's issues of control, for instance. You're not dealing with like, when you meet people, you're always dealing with whatever they're throwing out at the moment. We always respond according to like what's going on out there, or we take charge in terms of whatever is going on out there. I'm trying to just let it happen. I'm trying to just sort of see, again, never forgetting that I am the photographer. And obviously I do have a certain amount. I mean, there's no doubt about it, but I still remember that. And I try to offer as much as I can to the other person so that I'm not only taking, but that I'm giving. And in the end, we're both getting something out of the relationship. And what I see is, I mean, I get a lot. For me, I get a lot. But not only do I get a lot emotionally, I get a photograph. What I have heard from the models, for the most part, is that it was like leaving a shrink's office. Just been so seen. And I think what I'm giving is what I'm also getting. I think we're giving and getting in return. And that to me, that is such a beautiful kind of exchange. I mean, because I'm really interested in uncovering my own, I mean, this is a vulnerability podcast. And I mean, my work is so much about delving into my own vulnerability. So I try to, look at things that I'm afraid of and try to deal with them in individual series. I mean, I can do it clearly with the still lifes that you're looking at behind me. But I'm also really interested in kind of doing it with people, because with people, it's always the hard. I mean, working in my studio alone is actually, it's fabulous. I mean, it's wonderful. It is. I mean, I have like no restraints. When I bring someone else along, I mean, I'm just much more vulnerable. I feel much more vulnerable, and people always ask me that, like, what are you vulnerable about? You're the photographer. But I do. I feel like when I invite someone, like I said, I have this shoot this afternoon, and it's, I guess the things that come up are all the old childhood things of, will I do okay? Will I make a good portrait? Will I please them? Will I please me?
Interesting. I think I might take that as an opportunity to jump into, and I'm not sure if I'm remembering the title right, but I think you have a project called Imminent Fear. Is that right? A video project?
Yes, I do.
I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you a little bit more about that project, why you started and what it's about.
So, that was done in 2000. I can hear from your accent that you must be Canadian, correct?
Oh no, it's the way I said about. It's
And project.
yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I made that project actually up at Banff, at a residency at Banff. I was very lucky to get that for that particular period of time. It was during the 2004 election in the States. And I don't know if being Canadian, you may not remember it, but I remember
Follow
it.
that. That is almost more important than our own elections, is what happens in the US.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So it was Kerry Bush, I believe, and we had gotten into the war in Iraq, and we were being bombarded by fear. Like the whole part of the election was, they're going to come get us, or we have to be worried, and there's, I forget, nuclear weapons in Iraq, some nonsense. So I used that as sort of a pretext to kind of like an open sort of an idea, because it was such a time of like fear mongering in the United States. So, I am interested in exploring my fears through all of my work. This was the first and the most obvious one that I did. I came up with 20, I think it's actually 19 questions, and they are very specifically ordered. I asked 50 different people the same questions, all moving around into this question of fear. But you can't just come up to someone and just go right up and go, okay, so listen, tell me, like, what you're afraid of, and expect to get a real answer. So all my lead up questions were, and they're all on the website, like they were all like, so, are you afraid of dying? Are you afraid of, of winning? Are you afraid of flying? What are they're all, it's like a whole lot of lead ups. And at the very final end, after we've been talking for a half an hour, I go, so what are you afraid of? And by then people have kind of warmed up and are able to kind of say something a little bit deeper. So I took these like half an hour to 40-minute videos, and I edited them down to about a minute or two each. And then I broke them up into 4 sections. So it's like a 4-monitor video. And in each one, there are 12 talking heads. I basically picked the most poignant piece that I thought from each interview. So everyone's kind of talking about different things. And it's 50 people from all over the world. Oh, so my whole thing about being at Banff was that there were artists from all over the world, at this residency. And so there are people from Belarus, people from Japan, from China, from all over the world. And everyone has like a different way of expressing themselves. So I think with all of my work, with my videos, with the Freedom and Fear video, with my videos of women, it's not just what they're saying, but it's the way they say it. And you can tell if you look, if you're someone who's tuned into these kinds of things, as you watch the videos, and it's a very fascinating video. You can even tell when people are kind of like bullshitting. You can tell if someone's really looking, or if they're actually and being honest. You can tell kind of how much depth they're going into the question. And some of them are really digging, and others are not. Others are being cautious with their answers. And all of that is interesting to me. It really was the beginning of my understanding that working with people and is a way to kind of just, I think it was the very beginning of me moving away from photographing my own family, because photographing my children was pretty safe, until they were like, we're done. We are so done with this thing. So moving into working with other people was more frightening for me. Sort of imposing upon them what I wanted to talk about felt sort of frightening. Risky.
Right. I think it's interesting also because, when we first started talking, you talked about moving to the US as a young child who didn't speak English and didn't feel comfortable. Maybe you weren't able to express yourself the way you wanted to, or be articulate, or ask for the things, or talk about the things that you wanted to. And then photography obviously is a very visual medium. And video can be very visual, but that kind of video has visual aspect and a lot of auditory text based content, right? So what you're talking about now is people talking about what they're afraid of and the words that they're using and the expressions maybe, which either contradicts or works with what they're showing you visually. And I find it very interesting that you moved into that. So you reintroduced that kind of text based, word based interpretation of people's fears or people's vulnerabilities beyond photographs. I think that's cool.
And I do have some other projects. There's one called After Sergeant, and then there's another one called Something Like Love, somewhere in like 2011 through 2014, those two projects. And it may not, I mean, unless you scroll down, you won't see it, but I would photograph these people. And then I would, after, I would send an email afterwards and say, thanks so much for coming. And if you are willing, I'd love to ask you, these questions. And so for one of the projects, the questions were, what do you long for? What do you regret? And what are you afraid of? And I always said, listen, if I ever publish any of these, they will be anonymous. I will never reveal who did who said what. And, a lot of people answered. For Something Like Love, I asked them, what does love feel like to you? I probably got less answers on that one. So there was a different kind of text. I've not published books in those. I've not published those, and I've not actually shared. It's on my website, but I have not actually shared the verbal part. And so in my newer work, I'm kind of going more with the disguised just, there's these women that I'm just photographing that are they're not speaking, but they're doing. They're just standing there, and really, again, I'm allowing them to project whichever they want. So some of them just stand there and they're very strong, that they others squirm. I mean, we all have different ways of standing in front of a camera. And I'm very interested in how each one presents. And they all, often they're like, what do you want me to do? And I always say, you just do, just whatever you do is okay. It's fine. And I think that's one of the running threads. It's I so much always wanted to just be allowed to just be. I think I felt so imposed upon that this is part of what I tried to give out.
So I don't want to pry at all, but when you say you felt imposed upon, just generally, was that about the kinds of things you wanted to do with your life? Was it the ways you wanted to be able to express yourself with people, or what form did that take when you felt like you were being imposed upon and you needed to break out and express yourself in a different way?
In every way. I think in every way. I think from being allowed to express an opinion, from being allowed to think an opinion, from being allowed to, being given the space to be heard, from wanting to be an artist and being told that's just dumb. A lot of things. I think it was just really a whole, I think, there was a lot, growing up for me, there was very much about this is the way things were done and this is the way they were going to be done. And I just didn't fit into that. I wasn't, I had a very different need. I did different needs. I needed to express myself in very, very different ways. And it wasn't really, those ways were not really kind of offered, allowed, really.
Can I just ask then, what was it that you kind of dug into to be able to say for yourself, I'm going to do this my own way. I am going to follow my path. And I understand you guys have different opinions about this, but I'm going in that direction.
Oh, well, as much as I was very restricted, and really it came from my mother, not my father. So I did have someone in the family who was offering, freedom. My father was extremely open to, my father, even from when he was dying, and this was when I was back, many, 26 years ago, I remember he said before he died, he was always like this. He was always like this. He said, I know you, when you figure this out, what you need to do, you are going to do a good job. So I think I did always have that behind me. But, and to be honest, my mom, who really was the more authoritative person in the family, she actually was the creative one of the two of them. she was not a rule follower. And I think I just related to that. As much as it was her way or the highway, there was still a sense, I mean, you watched your mom, this is your role model. And one of the things I did learn, despite the fact that I was not encouraged to be like this, I was like, well, you're going to be defiant. Why wouldn't I? I don't know what it was that in my head, I was always, from the very beginning, I just said, there is not a chance that I'm going to go along with this. So I was an extremely defiant child. I mean, I got punished for it, but it just, that was my modus operandi. Being defiant is great in a sense because it really allows you to move forward. And it is my perseverance and my defiance that has allowed me to kind of just like move into a life that was exactly designed for, just exactly the way I want it to be. But it's not without its, consequence. I mean, there are certain things that come with it.
And interesting, because I'm not sure if this question makes sense, but when you were talking, I was thinking about you describing yourself as defiant, and I wanted to kind of put vulnerable as the flip side of that, and how you see that in yourself, maybe, and also in the people that you photograph. So how that theme might run through your life and through your work.
I see allowing yourself to explore your vulnerabilities as a really courageous act. I think we're so, in general, people, not me, but I think we're so afraid of looking at our own fear. You kind of see that a lot, I think, when you speak with people. They're not willing to kind of look inside at what, and I understand that we do that because it's too difficult and too frightening and too painful to look at it. The problem that if you don't look at it, you never get past it. And so for me, it's been fascinating to look at what I was not able to look at as a child. I'm really interested in my unconscious motivations, the things that have sort of like things that I grew up with that I've had to learn. Why do I do that? And I think about it, and it's like, I see it's coming from here. And there's all this. And if I want to change that, I now understand why I do it. And I can say, yeah, I don't need to do that anymore. I don't generally say this in public, but no, I am bringing the viewer into my own childhood fears, what it felt like.
And that comes through. That definitely came through when I was looking at those photos. Well, thank you for that. They are beautiful.
I have this thing I wrote the other day that I kind of like. So when I'm making a portrait, it always feels like an intimate dance between us. As we look at one another, the walls come down, and the process, for me, becomes a dialogue between the past and the present, where I try to make the invisible visible, to express the inexpressible, that which was silenced in me as a child.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today. I appreciate that a lot. It was wonderful.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for keeping it so open and letting me actually say the things that are important to me.